The wrench slipped from Evan Parker's hand and hit the gravel driveway with a small, sharp clang, and for a moment that was the only sound in the world, because everything else had simply stopped. He was on one knee beside the open door of a matte black SUV, sleeves rolled to the elbow, grease worked into the creases of his knuckles the way it always was by mid-afternoon, and he was looking at Grace Brooks the way a man looks at something he has been praying for, and never quite believed he would see. She was 8 years old. She had not stood on her own in 14 months. And now she was pushing herself up out of the wheelchair her mother had bought from a specialist in Geneva, one hand braced white-knuckled on the armrest, the other reaching out toward him like a compass needle finding north, and she was walking. 3 steps. Small, trembling, terrible, beautiful steps across the flagstone, her sneakers scuffing unevenly, her whole body leaning into the effort like she was carrying something heavier than herself. Behind her, halfway between the front doors of the estate and the driveway, Natalie Brooks froze with a phone still lifted halfway to her ear, her mouth open around a word that never made it out, her heels rooted to the stone as if the ground itself had reached up and taken hold of her. The phone slipped from her fingers and cracked against the flagstone, and she didn't look down at it, because she was looking at her daughter's legs, at Grace's legs, moving on their own for the first time since the accident that doctors in 3 different countries had said would never let her walk again. To find out how Natalie Brooks, one of the most powerful women in the country, ended up on her knees on her own driveway, with her daughter's paralysis reversing itself into her arms, and what it would cost her to learn the truth about the mechanic she had trusted, with nothing but her cars, stay until the very end. If stories like this one, about the people we underestimate, the ones we walk past every day without ever really seeing, mean something to you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. And here's the question worth sitting with before we go back to where it all began. Should a man who sees a struggling child getting quietly stronger say something right away, even if it isn't his place, or does real trust only get built by proving yourself first, one small act at a time, long before anyone gives you permission to care? 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Natalie Brooks did not know Evan Parker's name. She knew him, if she knew him at all, as the mechanic from the garage on Route 9 who had been recommended by her assistant when the check engine light on her 3rd car in 18 months refused to go off. Natalie ran Brooks Meridian, a logistics and manufacturing conglomerate her father had built from a single trucking depot into a company that moved freight across 4 continents and employed close to 11,000 people. And in the 11 months before that driveway, she was fighting for its survival. A merger with a European shipping consortium was closing in on its final quarter, a deal worth $420 million that would either secure the company for another generation or, if the board lost confidence in her, hand control to men who had spent decades waiting for her father's daughter to fail. She worked 80-hour weeks. She missed recitals and parent-teacher conferences and, 3 times that year, the actual anniversary of the car accident that had crushed 2 vertebrae in her daughter's spine and left the doctors speaking to her in the careful, hedged language people use when they don't want to be the one who takes away hope entirely. She hired the best specialists. She hired physical therapists who came to the house 4 days a week. And still Grace sat in that wheelchair, quieter every month, and Natalie had begun to accept, in the small hours when the house was silent and the merger paperwork blurred on the screen in front of her, that this might simply be the shape of the rest of her daughter's life. Evan Parker had been a widower for 6 years. His wife, Miriam, had died of an aggressive cancer 18 months after their daughter Sophie was born, and in the years since, Evan had built a life that asked for nothing from anyone. He owned a small garage 2 towns over, 4 bays and a gravel lot, and he was good at his work in the specific, unglamorous way that never gets written up anywhere. Engines that other shops had given up on, transmissions that came back from him running smoother than the day they left the factory. He had once, a long time ago, been something else entirely. A senior mechanical engineer on an automotive safety team, the kind of job that came with a title and a parking spot and a salary that let a young family breathe easy. He did not talk about that anymore. It was a door he had shut and nailed a board across, for reasons that had everything to do with protecting Sophie, who was 6 now, and did not need to know that her father had once had a career worth losing. He raised her alone. He drove her to school every morning in a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and every night, no matter how late the work ran, he read to her until she fell asleep, because that was the one thing he had promised himself he would never let the world take from either of them. The two lives intersected because of a stuck fuel injector. Natalie's household manager had called the garage on Route 9 in a mild panic. Mrs. Brooks needed the Range Rover, running by Friday. There was a dinner in the city. Could someone come out to the estate? Evan didn't usually do house calls, but the money was good and the schedule was flexible. And so, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, he pulled his truck through the iron gates of a property larger than the entire block his garage sat on. And he met Grace Brooks for the first time. She was on the porch in her wheelchair, a physical therapist packing up equipment a few feet away, and she was watching him with the flat, unimpressed patience of a child who has been the subject of too many well-meaning adults and has stopped expecting anything different from a new one. Evan didn't perform sympathy at her. He didn't crouch down to make himself smaller or use the sing-song voice adults reserve for children they've decided are fragile. He asked her, while he waited for a part to be delivered, whether she wanted to hand him tools, and when she said she couldn't reach that far from the chair, he simply rolled a low stool over and set the toolbox on it, at her height, and let her pass him sockets one at a time for 40 minutes while he explained, in plain, unhurried language, what each one did. It was the first time in 14 months that anyone had asked Grace Brooks to do something, rather than have something done to her. Natalie was on a call in her home office through most of that first visit, and she registered the mechanic only as a line item, competent, on time, reasonably priced, gone by 5. She did not know that her daughter had laughed twice that afternoon, a fact the housekeeper mentioned to her almost as an aside a week later. The way you'd mention a change in the weather. She did not know that Grace had asked, unprompted, when the mechanic was coming back. She had no reason yet to notice Evan Parker at all, and that, more than anything else, was about to change, because the SUV would need servicing again in 3 weeks, and the one after that in 5. And each time Evan came, he would spend a little longer than the job strictly required, kneeling beside a girl in a wheelchair, asking her to grip his forearm and try, just try, to shift her weight forward an inch. Never calling it therapy, never calling it anything at all, just calling it helping him hold something steady while he worked. 8 months would pass, full of quiet Tuesday afternoons neither woman in that family fully understood the meaning of yet, before the day Grace finally stood up on her own and ran toward the only adult in her life who had ever simply expected her to be able to. The trouble started on a Thursday in late spring, 7 months after that first visit to the estate. And it started because Natalie Brooks finally had a free hour and used it to come home early. She had not planned to catch anything. She had planned to sign a stack of documents at the kitchen island and be back in the city by 6 for a dinner with the European partners, whose lead negotiator, a controlled and exacting man named Julian Voss, had spent the better part of the year making it clear that Brooks Meridian's survival in this deal depended on Natalie projecting nothing but total, unwavering command of her company, and though he never said it outright, of her household. So when Natalie walked around the side of the house toward the garden and saw Evan Parker standing behind her daughter's wheelchair with his hands hovering an inch from Grace's shoulders, while the girl stood, unsupported, both hands white-knuckled on a patio railing, her legs trembling under her own weight for the first time in Natalie's presence, Natalie did not feel joy. She felt something closer to vertigo, a violent lurch of fear dressed up as anger, because nobody had told her this was happening, because a mechanic, a man with no medical license, no physical therapy certification, no business whatsoever putting his hands anywhere near her daughter's recovery, had apparently decided on his own that he knew better than every specialist who had examined Grace's spine. She crossed the lawn fast enough that her voice was still climbing by the time she reached them, and words came out of her that she would spend the following months trying to unsay. She told Evan this was dangerous. She told him Grace's spine had 2 fused vertebrae and a surgical hardware placement that could be catastrophically re-injured by exactly the kind of unsupervised strain he was allowing. And did he understand that? Did he understand what he could have done? Did he think this was a game? Grace, startled by her mother's tone, lost her grip on the railing and sat down hard back into the chair Evan had kept positioned directly behind her. And the sound she made was not pain. It was frustration, a wounded, furious little cry that Natalie misread entirely as injury, and that made her turn on Evan with something close to hatred in her voice. She told him he was fired. She told him if her daughter's condition worsened by even a fraction of a degree, she would have lawyers at his garage before the sun went down. She told him, and this was the line that would sit in Evan's chest like a swallowed stone for months afterward, that he had no right to give a disabled child false hope just to feel like a hero. That hope like that was cruelty dressed up as kindness, and that people like him never had to live with the consequences of the fantasies they sold to families like hers. Evan said almost nothing. He had never, in 8 months of quiet Tuesday afternoons, told Natalie what he was doing, and standing there on the lawn being accused of recklessness and vanity, he found he still couldn't find a way to explain it that wouldn't sound exactly like the excuse she'd already decided it was. He could have told her about the physical therapist's own discharge notes, which he'd once glimpsed on the porch table, and which described Grace's paralysis as incomplete rather than total, a distinction that mattered enormously, and that no one had ever explained to an 8-year-old in language she could hold on to. He could have told her that incomplete spinal injuries sometimes respond, slowly and unpredictably, to exactly the kind of graduated, patient weight-bearing work he'd been doing, work he understood far better than Natalie could have guessed. Because before he was a mechanic, he had spent 6 years as a mechanical engineer designing crash safety systems, work that had put him elbow to elbow with orthopedic researchers studying spinal trauma in test subjects for years at a stretch. He could have told her all of it. Instead, he picked his toolbox up off the flagstone, said only that he understood, and walked back to his truck, and Grace watched him go with an expression on her small face that Natalie would replay in her mind at 3 a.m. for weeks afterward, and never once, in that moment, let herself examine. He did not go back. There was no need for a second warning. Evan Parker had built his entire adult life around the principle of not making trouble for people who held power over him, a principle that had cost him more than Natalie could have imagined, and that he was not about to abandon now, for a job, over a woman's anger. He absorbed the loss the way he absorbed everything, quietly, without complaint, telling Sophie only that the SUV job had ended and asking her, the way he always did after a hard day, what she'd learned in school. What nobody in that house understood yet, and what Evan alone carried home with him that night, was that he had watched Grace's right leg bear 40% of her body weight, unassisted 3 days earlier, a fact he had been documenting privately in a battered notebook for months with the same careful precision he'd once used to log crash test telemetry, and that the small, furious cry Natalie had misread as pain had actually been the sound of an 8-year-old girl, who, for the first time in over a year, had wanted so badly to keep standing that being made to sit back down felt like a punishment. If you have ever been misjudged in the exact moment you were trying hardest to do right by someone, if you know what it is to have your quietest, most careful work mistaken for recklessness by the one person whose trust you wanted most, tell us in the comments, because so many of you watching tonight have carried that particular kind of silence yourselves. And it raises the older, harder question underneath all of it. When the credentialed experts have already told a family what to expect, should the quiet, self-taught competence of someone without the right letters after his name ever be trusted with something this fragile? Or does real responsibility only belong to the people the paperwork says are qualified to hold it? For 6 weeks afterward, Grace refused to work with the new physical therapist Natalie hired, a warm and well-credentialed woman named Priya who did everything correctly and by the book and who Grace, without ever quite explaining why, would not cooperate with. She stopped attempting to bear weight at all. She grew quieter at dinner, and once, when Natalie asked gently what was wrong, Grace only said that Evan used to let her hold the wrench, and Natalie had no idea what that meant and did not, in the exhaustion of that season, push hard enough to find out. The merger negotiations entered their most brutal phase that same month. $420 million balanced on quarterly numbers that kept sliding sideways. Julian Voss growing colder and more exacting in every call, the board's patience visibly thinning in every meeting Natalie sat through with her hands folded to keep them from shaking. She told herself the two crises were unrelated. She told herself Grace's regression was simply grief catching up to her, a delayed reckoning with a diagnosis she'd never fully processed. She did not let herself consider, not yet, that the coldest, cruelest thing she had done all year might have happened on her own lawn, to a man who had never asked her for a single thing in return for what he'd quietly been giving her daughter. 6 weeks would pass before the first small crack appeared in that certainty, not from Grace, and not from Evan, but from a name on an old employee file that Natalie's assistant would bring to her almost by accident. The kind of coincidence that only looks like coincidence until you're far enough away to see the whole shape of it. The crack began, as these things often do, somewhere Natalie wasn't looking. Her assistant, a sharp and quietly observant young man named Dominic Reyes, had been assembling due diligence materials for the merger's final phase, cross-referencing old supplier and safety compliance records that Brooks Meridian's manufacturing division had inherited from a subcontractor it acquired years earlier. Buried in a decade-old incident file was a name that meant nothing to the lawyers reviewing it, and everything. When Dominic happened to mention it to Natalie in passing, to the mother who had spent 6 weeks unable to stop thinking about a mechanic's quiet retreat from her driveway, Evan Parker, formerly of Holloway Kinetics, the crash safety engineering firm that had designed the seatbelt tensioning system implicated, years earlier, in a since-settled lawsuit, a lawsuit whose internal documents suggested the actual design flaw had been introduced by a change pushed through late in development by a senior colleague, eager to hit a deadline, and that the junior engineer who had raised objections in writing, repeatedly on the record, had been quietly made the scapegoat when the story became public. The junior engineer's name, buried in a footnote nobody had read in 9 years, was Evan Parker. Natalie sat with that file open on her screen for a long time after Dominic left her office. She thought about a man who had spent 8 months teaching her daughter to trust her own legs again, without ever once mentioning that he had built an actual career on understanding exactly the kind of trauma Grace had survived. She thought about the word she'd used on the lawn, fantasy, and the specific surgical cruelty of having said it to someone who, it turned out, likely understood spinal biomechanics better than the physical therapist she'd hired to replace him. She did not confront anyone yet. She did what she had always done under pressure, which was to gather more information before she moved, and so she asked Dominic, carefully and without explaining why, to find out quietly what had actually happened at Holloway Kinetics 9 years earlier. It took him 4 days. What he brought back was worse than she'd braced for. Internal emails showing Evan had flagged the tensioning system defect 3 separate times before the recall that eventually followed, each time overruled by a senior colleague named Richard Calloway, a polished, well-liked engineering director who had gone on in the years since to a comfortable executive post at a rival firm, his reputation entirely intact, while Evan Parker's name had been quietly attached to the internal failure review and leaked, unofficially and unattributably, to just enough people in the industry that no engineering firm would return his calls afterward. He had a newborn daughter and a wife already sick with the cancer that would take her 18 months later. He had taken the fall, said nothing in his own defense beyond the paper trail he'd already created, and walked away from an entire profession rather than fight a battle that would have consumed years he didn't have to spare, years his daughter needed him whole for instead. Natalie did not sleep that night. She sat in her study with the old incident file and a glass of wine she never touched, and somewhere around 2 in the morning she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes very late at night, that she had spent 6 weeks punishing a man for the one unambiguously generous thing anyone had done for her daughter since the accident, and that she had done it using almost exactly the same language, reckless, irresponsible, a danger to people who trusted him, that Richard Calloway had presumably once used to bury him the first time. It is worth pausing here on the argument that runs through comment sections every time a story like this one gets told, because it is not a simple one and it deserves to be said plainly. Some viewers will say a man who understood exactly what was medically possible for Grace should have told her mother everything from the very first afternoon, credentials or not, rather than let a parent stumble into something this important half-blind. Others will say that a man who had already lost an entire career to speaking up when it wasn't welcomed had every right to stay quiet and let his work speak for itself instead, especially with a daughter of his own, depending on him never being blacklisted again. There is no clean answer to that, and this story doesn't pretend there is one. But it's worth sitting with before you decide which side you land on. She went to the garage on Route 9 the following Saturday, alone, without her driver, in jeans instead of the tailored suits Evan had only ever seen her in. He was under a Camry when she arrived, and he slid out on the creeper and stood, wiping his hands on a rag, saying nothing, waiting, the way he always waited, for other people to decide what happened next. Natalie had rehearsed an apology in the car and abandoned all of it within the first 10 seconds of actually standing in front of him. What came out instead was rawer and less composed than anything she'd said in a boardroom in a decade. She told him she knew about Holloway Kinetics. She told him she was sorry, genuinely and completely sorry, for every word she'd said on the lawn, and she asked him, this was the part she hadn't planned, what he actually wanted, because she had money and influence and the ability to fix almost any material problem a person could have, and she needed to know what would actually make this right. Evan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the only thing he'd wanted since the day she fired him, which was simply to be allowed to keep helping Grace, not as an employee and not as a favor, but because the girl had asked him to, and he'd made her a promise he intended to keep. And that he didn't want money, and he didn't want his name cleared publicly, because he had built a life where nobody needed to know who he used to be, and that life, quiet as it was, had kept his own daughter safe and fed for 6 years. Natalie left the garage that afternoon, having gotten a yes to the only question that mattered and having learned, in the process, that the man she'd humiliated wanted essentially nothing from her at all, which unsettled her more than any demand could have. The secondary crisis arrived 9 days later, and it arrived from the direction she least expected. Julian Voss called an emergency session of the merger committee after an anonymous complaint surfaced, alleging that Brooks Meridian's manufacturing division had known for years about the very Holloway Kinetics defect history now sitting in Natalie's own files, and had failed to disclose it during due diligence, a complaint that, if substantiated, could collapse the entire $420 million deal and expose the company to liability going back a decade. Natalie realized, sitting in that emergency call with her pulse hammering in her throat, that the only person alive who could speak with total, technical, first-hand authority to what had actually happened inside that defect review 9 years ago, the only person who could prove the flaw had been Calloway's, not a systemic failure Brooks Meridian's subcontractor had buried, was the mechanic she had fired from her driveway 6 weeks earlier for daring to help her daughter walk. 2 months would pass, filled with lawyers and depositions and a girl in a wheelchair asking her mother almost daily when Evan was coming back, before Natalie would have to walk into a conference room full of board members and ask a man with nothing left to prove to save her company for her, and discover, in the process, exactly how much more than gratitude she felt toward him. The deposition took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor. 11 board members and 2 attorneys for the European consortium, seated around a table that had cost more than Evan's truck, and he arrived in the same clean work shirt he wore to every job. No suit, no lawyer of his own, because Natalie had offered him the firm's best litigation counsel, and he had quietly declined, saying only that he preferred to just tell the truth and let people decide what to do with it. What followed, over the next 90 minutes, was the kind of demonstration of competence that no title or resume could have manufactured. Evan walked the room through the original tensioning system schematics from memory, reconstructing load calculations on a whiteboard with the unhurried precision of a man who had lived inside those numbers for years, showing exactly where the design deviated from his original specification and exactly which meeting, on exactly which date, Richard Calloway had overruled the change order despite 3 separate written objections that Evan had, fortunately, kept copies of in a fireproof box in his garage for 9 years, alongside his late wife's letters, because some part of him had never quite believed the story was finished. He did not raise his voice once. He did not look at Julian Voss's increasingly pale expression, or at the general counsel who had begun, halfway through, to take notes with visible urgency. He simply laid the facts down one at a time, the way he laid a socket back in its case, until it was no longer possible for anyone in that room to believe Brooks Meridian had concealed a defect it never actually caused. It was Dominic, working the phones in the anteroom, who found Richard Calloway's current employer within the hour, and, more importantly, an internal memo from that same company, leaked to him by a junior engineer there who had heard through industry back channels what was unfolding, and who had her own long-simmering grievances with Calloway's habit of overruling objections he didn't want to hear, showing that Calloway had made an almost identical override on a separate project 2 years earlier, one that had also resulted in a recall, also quietly absorbed by a subordinate who no longer worked in the industry. The pattern, once visible, was impossible to explain away as an honest mistake. Within the week, Calloway's current employer placed him on leave pending an internal investigation, and the same industry back channels that had once made sure no engineering firm would touch Evan Parker's resume now carried, in a matter of days, an entirely different story. One in which the junior engineer who'd been blamed 9 years earlier had, without a shred of self-interest, walked into a boardroom and handed a company he had every reason to resent the exact evidence it needed to survive. This was the piece worth sitting with, the second thread the story keeps circling back to, the one about whether experience earned outside the official channels deserves the same trust as experience earned inside them. A man with no engineering license anymore, no active credentials, nothing but a fireproof box of 9-year-old memos and a memory he'd never let go dull, had just done in 90 minutes what a room full of highly paid, formally credentialed attorneys and consultants had spent 2 frantic weeks failing to do. Some viewers watching this will say that's exactly why formal titles and paperwork matter less than we pretend they do. That real competence proves itself regardless of what letters follow a name. Others will say a man that capable should have found his way back into the credentialed world years ago, instead of disappearing into a garage. That talent like that owes itself to more than just one company's convenience when it finally needs it. Both instincts are reasonable, and this story doesn't resolve the debate cleanly. It just shows you what happened when one man decided quietly that being right mattered less to him than being left alone to raise his daughter in peace. Natalie watched the entire 90 minutes from the head of the table, and somewhere around the whiteboard calculations she stopped tracking the merger implications entirely and started simply watching him. The stillness in his hands, the total absence of performance, the way he answered even the sharpest, most needling questions from Voss's attorneys without a flicker of defensiveness, as though 9 years of injustice had simply never had the chance to curdle into bitterness because he'd never let it. When the room finally cleared, board members filing out already murmuring about redrafted terms and reputational upside rather than collapse, Natalie stayed behind, and so did Evan, gathering the marker caps off the whiteboard tray with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, and she said the thing she'd been holding since the garage, that she didn't know how to thank him for this, and that she was starting to understand thank you wasn't really the right word for what she owed him at all. Evan said only that he hadn't done it for the company. He'd done it because Grace had asked him 3 weeks earlier. In the careful, direct way children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding, whether he was in trouble because of her mother, and he had decided then that he would rather tell the truth than let an 8-year-old carry that particular worry for one more day. The company's reputational unraveling of Calloway proceeded quickly after that, aided by 2 more engineers from his past coming forward once the first crack in his record became public, each with their own quieter version of the same story. Objections raised, overridden, blame reassigned downward to whoever had the least power to fight back. Evan wanted no part of the public account of it. When a trade publication reached out for comment, he declined. And when Natalie offered, genuinely, to have Brooks Meridian issue a formal statement restoring his professional name in the industry, he asked her instead for something much smaller and far harder for her to refuse. 2 afternoons a week, permanently, set aside for Grace, regardless of what happened with the merger, regardless of what happened with the two of them. It was, Natalie realized only later, the first time in the entire ordeal that Evan Parker had asked her for anything at all, and the smallness of the request, next to everything he could have taken instead, told her more about who he was than the whiteboard calculations ever had. 3 weeks later, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, that neither of them would ever call unremarkable again, Grace stood up from her wheelchair on the driveway without anyone's hands hovering near her shoulders, took 3 shaking steps toward the man crouched beside a Range Rover with a wrench in his hand, and ran the rest of the way into an ending neither Natalie nor Evan had let themselves imagine out loud. The merger closed 6 weeks after that afternoon on the driveway, at $435 million, $15 million above the original terms, because Julian Voss's consortium had come away from the entire episode more impressed by Brooks Meridian's handling of the crisis than they had ever been by its quarterly numbers, and because Natalie Brooks had insisted, over the objections of exactly 2 board members who no longer had much standing left to object to anything, that the final agreement include a formal, public reinstatement of Evan Parker's original engineering credit on the tensioning system design, filed permanently into the industry's safety record under his own name, 9 years after it had been quietly taken from him. She did it without asking him first, which she knew, walking into his garage to tell him, might not sit well with a man who had spent 9 years asking for nothing. He listened to the whole explanation standing beside a half-disassembled engine, wiping his hands slowly on a rag, and when she finished, he didn't smile exactly, but something in his shoulders loosened that she had never seen loosen before, and he said only that Sophie would like knowing that, someday, when she was old enough to understand what it meant that her father used to build things that kept people safe. The public acknowledgement, when it came, was smaller than Natalie had first imagined it. No press conference, no ceremony, just a quiet paragraph in the merger's public filings, and a private dinner Natalie insisted on hosting for the 2 families, board members conspicuously uninvited, at a restaurant Grace picked, because it had a fish tank in the lobby she wanted to show Sophie. Evan had been offered, in the weeks before that dinner, almost everything a man in his position might reasonably have wanted. A formal engineering directorship inside Brooks Meridian's manufacturing safety division, a salary that would have let him close the garage forever, a public restoration campaign that would have rebuilt his professional reputation industry-wide within a year. He turned down the directorship, gently and without hesitation, and asked instead for something Natalie hadn't anticipated, and that took her a full week to arrange to his satisfaction. A small, unglamorous continuing education fund inside the company, unattached to his own name, set up to quietly cover legal and reputational support for any engineer at Brooks Meridian or its subcontractors who raised a safety objection and found themselves punished for it rather than heard. He wanted the next Evan Parker, whoever and wherever that person turned out to be, to have somewhere to go that he never had. The quiet coda arrived 4 months later, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon with nothing writing on it at all. No merger, no deposition, no crisis pressing at the edges of the day. Evan was in the driveway of the estate, not working on anything, just sitting on the low stone wall by the garden while Grace walked slow, steady, unremarkable laps around the fountain on legs that still tired quickly, but no longer trembled the way they once had. Sophie trailing a few steps behind her with the easy patience only children extend to each other. Natalie came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat down on the wall beside him without asking, which had become, somewhere in the last 4 months, simply how the 2 of them existed around each other now. She asked him, watching the girls circle the fountain, what he thought real worth actually was. A question she admitted, a little embarrassed, that she'd been turning over since the boardroom. Since the driveway, since a version of herself that used the word fantasy at a man trying to give her daughter something no specialist in 3 countries had managed to. Evan thought about it for a while, the way he thought about everything, and said that he supposed worth wasn't the thing people said about you in a room, or the title on a door, or even the name filed on a patent 9 years too late. It was just what you did, quietly, On the ordinary Tuesdays nobody was watching, for people who couldn't yet do anything for you in return. Natalie didn't say anything back. She just let her shoulder rest against his for a moment, in the specific, unhurried way of two people who had already stopped needing to explain themselves to each other, while their daughters kept walking their slow, steady, thoroughly unremarkable circles around a fountain that neither of them, watching, would ever again take for granted. There is a version of this story in almost every life, even if the details never come with fountains or boardrooms or fired mechanics. A person who kept showing up quietly for someone else with nothing to gain, who got misjudged for it before anyone bothered to understand what they were actually doing, who never once demanded to be seen and was eventually seen anyway. Because the truth of a person like that has a way of standing up on its own, one shaking step at a time, whether or not the room is ready for it. Has someone in your own life ever been that person, dismissed too quickly, misread by someone under pressure, quietly doing the right thing long before anyone gave them credit for it? Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's only now, years later, that you're finally giving them credit they always deserved. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in our own lives are worth staying for, worth watching for, worth this kind of story being told about them, we'd love to have you stay part of this one with us. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story, right up until the very last truth in it.